The sulfur cycle is the next one we'll look at. This is an important component of proteins and vitamins. So we need sulfur to be recycled in order for us to get those nutrients. Many bacteria use sulfur compounds in photosynthesis or types of cellular respiration. Decomposers are responsible for returning sulfur to the soil or the atmosphere. So we talked about chemosynthesis in chapter 1 and hydrogen sulfide that gets basically used for chemosynthesis and the sulfuric acid that gets produced. So the bacteria actually help convert sulfur from one form to another. Typically, it's from an unusable form to a usable form. So here is a picture of our sulfur cycle. So we get sulfur from iron sulfides in rocks, coal, oil, and ore, so deep in our earth core. It's extracted through mining and fossil fuel burning. So that essentially creates sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide has to be converted to sulfate in the atmosphere, and then typically it comes back as acid precipitation or an acid rain format. But then once it either falls to our oceans or falls to our land, it goes deeper down, and the bacteria that are there or decomposers that are there actually convert it back into another form that can be used. So if it goes back into our oceans, it can be absorbed and then come back out through our seafloor vents, be released back into the atmosphere as gas. If it comes into our land, we have hydrogen sulfide, or H2S, that is essentially created or converted back and forth between inorganic sulfur and sulfate. So we have a bacteria that is responsible for this whole interface here. So from an unusable material to a usable material, that sulfate is something that plants can take up, or hydrogen sulfide, depending on where they're located, could take that up. Decomposition occurs, and so we can continue to go through this cycle here as part of the sulfur cycle, or this hydrogen sulfide or inorganic sulfur can come up through the ground, through volcanoes, geological uplifting and upwelling in groundwater, and then once it's released as a gas, becomes sulfur dioxide, and then sulfate as an ion before it comes back down to our Earth. With acid deposition, the combustion of fossil fuels has sulfur in it, and that's where the sulfur dioxides come from. This sulfur dioxide reacts with oxygen and water that we already have in the atmosphere, and that's where we get sulfuric acid and sulfurous acid. So just a different form of sulfate in order to get the different types of acid. When acid condenses, so it forms into those droplets, it falls as acid precipitation. So the acid can change the soil and water pH, and that can make it really challenging, if not impossible, for organisms to survive there. So if our water pH is acidic or our soil is acidic, certain organisms are no longer able to live. So the next cycle, the nitrogen cycle, is required by organisms so that we can get amino acids that make up our proteins that our bodies use, as well as our DNA. Nitrogen gas in our atmosphere can't be used for this purpose, so it has to be converted into forms that we can actually use to get these proteins. We either have nitrogen fixation or ammonification. Nitrogen fixation is the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium, so it's NH4. Nitrogen fixing bacteria are responsible for this, and we find them in nodules that are attached to the roots of legumes. So those are different types of plants that we'll look at here on one of the upcoming slides. Ammonification also produces ammonium as bacteria break down organic matter. So with this one, we have the nitrogen fixation from atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium, whereas we have breakdown of organic matter into ammonium. Denitrification is when we have bacteria that break down nitrogen compounds and release nitrogen gas back to the atmosphere. And this is where we have anaerobic environments that you'll see this. So where there's a lack of oxygen, you'll be able to see this one happening. So here's the picture you've been waiting for. This is our explanation of the nitrogen cycle. So again, we have ammonification and nitrification, as well as our nitrogen fixing soil bacteria or nitrifying bacteria that are converting these nitrates into usable form. So if we start with our nitrogen in the atmosphere, it has to be broken down somehow into usable forms. We have denitrifying bacteria or nitrogen fixing bacteria. So this would be a legume. They're found in the roots, root nodules of these legumes. So they're fixing this nitrogen into usable forms. So nitrogen fixing, we get ammonium. Ammonium is converted into nitrites that are converted into nitrates that can be used by plants and then consumed by animals. And then if they are released from the animals, the decomposers allow that process to continue through either aerobic or anaerobic nitrification or ammonification to allow that to become more usable for us. Video here explains it really well. Definitely look at that one to get a better explanation. Here's your first checkpoint. How can acid deposition affect ecosystems? What is the general role of bacteria in the sulfur cycle? And what are two sources of fixed nitrogen that plants can use? The last cycle we have is the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is needed for cellular materials like DNA, phospholipids, ATP, right, adenosine triphosphate. Phosphorus does not cycle in the atmosphere, but we will find it in soil and water. So you won't find it above the earth like we've seen in the other cycles. Large amounts of phosphorus are stored in rocks. They're released during erosion. So this limits the growth of plants because they need it in the form of phosphate. So it needs to be water soluble. If we add excess phosphorus, this can cause uncontrolled growth of algae and plant life, and that can reduce the available oxygen in different ecosystems, specifically when we're looking at aquatic life. But we'll get into that here on the next slide. So algal blooms occur when there's an overabundance of algae due to phosphates in the water. So if we have lots of phosphates in the water, the algae are rapidly producing, and so they're using up the available water that's there. Decomposers break down matter and use up the oxygen that the algae are producing, and that results in the death of fish and other aquatic life because the oxygen's not available for them to use. So here's our phosphorus cycle. We have phosphorus, again, has to stay either within the soil or the water. So rain helps with the movement of phosphorus from the ground into the waters or from our rocks or other sediments into water. So we have weathering of phosphate from rocks that can be released as runoff or through runoff into lakes. Plants also use the phosphorus, and animals then eat the plants. Decomposers obviously eat what's left behind. And so that's where the phosphate in the soil comes from. Phosphate can also leach into groundwater through soil. And so once it's dissolved, it could be from either chemical precipitation, through leaching, through runoff. Somehow it gets into the water. It can settle into the bottom so that the decomposers that are there can use it up. The sedimentation can create new rocks, and that can essentially go to geological uplifting. I mean, that takes hundreds of thousands of years, but that would be a potential to cycle the phosphorus through our system again. So we always have energy involved in each step of these cycles, so it doesn't go without the use of energy. Water is also necessary in all of these cycles so that the biogeochemical cycles are linked through energy and water. So if you're ever asked how these cycles are connected, it's always through water and energy. Here's your checkpoint on these cycles. Why do organisms need phosphorus? How is phosphorus transported through the biosphere? And what are the effects of increased amount of phosphorus on aquatic environments? Section 2.2 reviews on page 52 if you want to take a look there. And there's a really great video here to go over these cycles with you as well.